You wouldn't expect it. Not in Ouagadougou, not on a morning like that, but that's when it happened. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, leader of a nation under pressure, found himself holding a letter from Jamaica. Not an official memo, not a diplomatic demand, a personal note from Usain Bolt. Yes, that Usain Bolt, the fastest man alive. What could a world-class sprinter possibly want with a military captain turned president? Turns out everything. Because when the world stops watching and the medals are tucked away, what's left is respect. And one man recognizing another for courage, for conviction, for daring to run when the ground itself is shaking. If you believe that a small nation can still stand tall against global giants, if you believe that Africa deserves to write its own story in its own voice, if you've ever seen the fire burning in Captain Ibrahim Traoré's eyes, then this story belongs to you too. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, not just to support, but to walk alongside us. Together we're riding a wave of awakening. What once was whispered has become a quiet storm. And then came the letter. It wasn't official. It wasn't expected. But it changed everything. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had seen hundreds of documents cross his desk, some urgent, some classified, some dangerous. But never anything like this. A plain envelope sun-faded at the edges, marked with a Jamaican stamp. He hesitated for a moment, then opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter. The signature at the bottom hit him like a bolt of lightning. Usain Bolt. The fastest man in the world had written to him. Not to a president, not to a government, but to a man, a soldier, a captain, a fighter trying to hold his country together. And the letter was personal, deeply so. Bolt spoke of running barefoot through the dusty roads of Trelawney, of feeling invisible, of being told he was too wild, too fast, too much. He wrote about finding his rhythm, about defying the odds, about learning to run not just for himself, but for something greater. It was more than a letter. It was a spark. Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat in silence, reading it over and over. His country was under pressure from all sides. Poverty, insurgency, foreign interference. And yet here was a message from across the ocean. From a man with no political obligation, no diplomatic ties, just admiration and respect. Traoré wasn't used to being seen this way. Not by the West, not by celebrities, certainly not by sporting legends. But in that moment, something shifted. Because Bolt didn't see a rebel, he saw a runner. A man in the race of his life, not for medals, but for his people's future. And sometimes that kind of recognition is more powerful than any weapon. But what do you say to a man like Usain Bolt? Captain Ibrahim Traoré stared at the page. Words from the world's fastest man still echoed in his mind. It wasn't politics, it wasn't flattery. It was something far more human, and that made it harder to respond. He wasn't writing a speech, he wasn't addressing a crowd. He was replying to a man who had seen him not as a title, but as a soul. He called in his aide Alima. Smart, intuitive, multilingual, she understood nuance better than most. He wrote to you, she whispered, eyes wide. Yes, Captain Traoré replied, and not as a president, as a fellow runner. He handed her the letter. Her hands trembled. What followed was a quiet storm inside that office. For a leader used to giving orders, Traoré found it oddly difficult to find the right tone. Every word felt too formal, too distant. He wasn't writing from a palace, he was writing from the battlefield of leadership, where each day was survival, and every decision carried weight. He paused, breathed, and then began. Dear Mr. Bolt. He wrote of women in the countryside, hands blistered from farming cracked soil, yet faces lit with pride. He wrote of young men building homes from rubble, not for wages but for hope. He spoke of the weight he carried of watching a broken nation rise slowly from its knees. We don't run on perfect tracks, he wrote, but we run anyway. Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't hide the truth. He let Bolt see it. The hunger, the hardship, the quiet strength buried in the soil of Burkina Faso. He told him plainly, Sometimes the finish line isn't clear, but we run because we must. He handed the letter back to Alima. She read it, then looked up. It's not just a reply, she said. It's a mirror. Captain Traore nodded, because sometimes the most powerful thing a leader can do is admit he's still learning how to run. And sometimes the most powerful thing a hero can do is stop and reach back for someone running behind. This was no longer just a conversation. It was the beginning of a bond. But letters alone were never going to be enough, not for men like them. Usain Bolt didn't stop at writing. The words had stirred something inside him, something restless, something bigger than personal pride. He started asking questions about Burkina Faso, about the Sahel, about the struggles far removed from sprint tracks and stadium lights. He spoke to his manager Marcus, the man who had warned him not to get involved. This isn't politics, Bolt said quietly. This is purpose. Then he did what few expected. He launched a community program, the Fast Lane for Change, designed to raise awareness and funding for educational and sports facilities in underdeveloped African regions, starting with Burkina Faso. A press conference was held. Cameras flashed. But Bolt didn't smile like he used to. His tone was serious. We're not just running anymore, he said. We're reaching back. Across the ocean in Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim Traoré heard the news. At first he said nothing, just nodded. Then he asked his advisors for silence. Let me hear the clip, he said. They played it. And when Bolt's voice echoed through the presidential office, something shifted. Captain Traoré rose to his feet. He's not just watching, he said. He's with us. That same week, Traoré instructed his team to organize a youth summit, one that combined sport leadership training and civic education. The theme, Run for Tomorrow. Hundreds of young people came, some barefoot, some hungry, all hopeful. During the opening speech, Traoré didn't talk about politics. He didn't mention policies. Instead, he told a story about a man who ran faster than anyone else, who turned back and offered his hand. A story about letters that became action, about strangers who became allies. He paused, then said, Captain Ibrahim Traoré is not just me. He is every young African fighting to move forward. And if Bolt can run for us, then we must run for each other. The applause shook the stadium. Later, a photo went viral. It showed a boy in a tattered Burkina Faso jersey, mid-sprint, mouth open, arms wide under a banner that read, You don't have to win to lead. The world took notice. Western media began covering the story. A sprinter and a soldier, one headline read. A friendship rewriting diplomacy, said another. But to those living it, this wasn't about fame, it was about fire. Captain Ibrahim Traoré and Usain Bolt had sparked something neither could fully control: a movement, a feeling, a rhythm that belonged not to one man, but to a continent waking up. And it all began with a simple truth. Real speed isn't measured in seconds, it's measured in impact. But soon the world began to ask questions. The letters had remained private, at first intimate human exchanges between two men from different worlds. But word got out. A rumor whispered in a press room, a sentence overheard by a foreign diplomat. And then suddenly it was everywhere. Usain Bolt is writing to Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Social media lit up. Headlines exploded. Some were curious, some were cynical. Why is a Jamaican sprinter involved with West African politics? What does Captain Traoré hope to gain from this friendship? But the most powerful question of all was simpler. What if this is real? Traoré's advisors urged caution. We're not ready for the spotlight, one of them warned. They'll twist the story. But Traoré didn't flinch. Let them look, he said. Let them see us. For the first time in months, Burkina Faso was being discussed not through the lens of terrorism or instability, but through the lens of hope, of solidarity, of connection. News anchors began quoting from the letters. Universities hosted debates. Activists called it empathy diplomacy. It wasn't about treaties, it was about truth. One man speaking to another without translation, without ego. Meanwhile, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood his ground. He refused to politicize the exchange. He didn't parade the letters for attention. He let the words speak for themselves. At a press briefing, a journalist asked him directly, "Do you believe one athlete can change the perception of an entire nation?" He smiled faintly. Sometimes, he said, one voice is louder than 1,000 microphones. In Kingston, Bolt felt the weight of that statement. He hadn't intended to become a symbol, but symbols don't ask for permission, they're born from action. He began sharing pieces of the letters in interviews. Not the politics, just the humanity. He told me Bolt said in one segment that his people don't run on tracks, they run on sand, through hardship, through fear. But they run anyway. That line struck a chord. In Burkina Faso, people painted it on school walls, wrote it on market stalls. Even the military began quoting it during training. What had started as a quiet exchange now echoed across cities, borders, hearts. And still the letters continued, each one deeper, each one more raw. Bolt began writing about failure, about the loneliness of expectation. Traore responded with stories of betrayal, of nights spent awake, wondering if tomorrow would hold. This was not diplomacy. This was something older, purer. Two men writing not to impress, but to understand. And through that understanding, the world began to shift its gaze, not in pity, but in respect. Because Captain Ibrahim Traoré was no longer just a soldier. He had become a storyteller. And Usain Bolt was no longer just a runner. He had become a bridge between struggle and strength, between silence and storm. But the most extraordinary thing was this: what began with a single letter refused to stay small. Months passed, yet the words between them didn't fade. If anything, they deepened. The letters were now framed in schools, quoted in sermons, debated in cafes, from Accra to Kingston. And slowly the world began to realize this wasn't about fame. This was about legacy. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had never intended to become a symbol. He was a soldier, a man forged in crisis. He didn't speak in sound bites. He didn't perform for cameras. Yet here he was, quoted by school children, admired by youth far beyond his borders. They didn't see him as a distant politician. They saw someone who understood, who didn't just sit in palaces but walked in their dust. And Usain Bolt, he had medals, yes, records, stadiums, but those things now felt smaller. He started to ask a new question: what do you do once you've run faster than anyone else? His answer came through action. He launched a scholarship fund in Captain Traoré's name, the Burkina Future Fund, to support young Africans studying leadership, agriculture, and education. We're not funding careers, he told reporters. We're investing in people who don't wait for tracks to be built. They run anyway. In Ouagadougou, Traoré was moved to silence. No statement, no applause. Just a long look out the window, watching school children pass by, chasing each other in joy, unaware of the weight their futures now carried. Later that night, he picked up his pen. He wrote one final letter. It wasn't long, but every word was honest. Mr. Bolt, you didn't just write to me. You reminded me that even in darkness, a voice can reach across oceans. You reminded my people that they matter. And you reminded me that leadership is not about command, but connection. He paused, then added, you once ran alone. Now the world is running with you. Bolt framed that letter, didn't post it, didn't tweet it, just read it, quietly, and smiled. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had become more than a head of state. He had become an echo, a call to every young person who felt forgotten, a reminder that greatness doesn't belong to the powerful or the rich or the fast. It belongs to those who dare to keep running when no one is watching. Together, Bolt and Traoré hadn't just exchanged words. They had planted something. And across classrooms, dusty roads, and crowded homes, it had started to grow. Quietly, steadily, a legacy made not of gold, but of courage. And it all began with one letter. The story did not end with applause. There were no grand ceremonies, no fireworks, no final lap. but something lasting had taken root in the silence between their words, in the weight of what was never spoken, and in the eyes of those who read their letters and saw themselves reflected within. Captain Ibrahim Traoré returned to his daily battles, the politics, the poverty, the pressure from forces far beyond his control, yet something had shifted. He no longer walked alone through those corridors of power. Somewhere in a quiet home in Jamaica, the world's fastest man had chosen to walk beside him, not with armies or strategies, but with truth. And truth spoken sincerely travels further than any bullet. The letters between Traoré and Bolt were no longer just ink on paper. They had become tools, seeds, beacons. They reminded people in Burkina Faso that their voices mattered even when the world refused to listen. And they reminded people in Jamaica that greatness wasn't just a personal victory. It was a shared purpose. Across both nations, new conversations began. Youth started asking different questions, not just how do I escape, but how do I build not who will save us, but who will I become? Teachers wove the story into classrooms. Artists turned the letters into murals. Even those who doubted were forced to pause, because somewhere deep down they recognized that this was rare. Two men from different worlds, neither chasing profit or attention, had simply seen each other, had chosen to care. And in a world that profits from division, that choice was quietly revolutionary. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, once described by international media as the unpredictable soldier, had become something else entirely, a leader who knew that soft power could be stronger than steel. A man who understood that dignity is not found in dominance, but in dialogue. And Usain Bolt, whose fame was built on milliseconds and medals, had discovered a new lane to run in, one that measured not speed, but service. Their paths may never cross in person, but that was never the point. The point was the bridge. A letter became a step, a response became a signal, action followed, and suddenly what began as private correspondence became a public movement, a call to those left behind, those overlooked, those fighting silent battles. And maybe that's what leadership truly is, not shouting the loudest, not winning the most, but knowing when to slow down, turn back, and say, I see you, I'm with you. Captain Ibrahim Traoré and Usain Bolt reminded us that history isn't always written in marble. Sometimes it's handwritten, folded, posted, and passed from hand to heart. So if you ever wonder whether a letter can change the world, remember this: it already did. And its echo is still running. If you believe that a small nation can still stand tall against the giants of this world, if you believe that Africa has the right to write its own story, in its own words, in its own voice, if you've ever seen the fire burning in the eyes of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, then this story is also yours. Like this video. Subscribe to this channel, not just to support, but to stand beside us. Together we are part of something bigger. A quiet storm is rising. What once were whispers across oceans are now echoes shaking foundations. This is not just a story, it's a signal. And if you've heard it, don't stay silent, run with us. The story of Captain Ibrahim Traoré and Usain Bolt teaches us that leadership and greatness are not confined to titles, borders, or professions. It reminds us that in a world dominated by noise, division, and ego, the most powerful gestures can often come from quiet, personal acts of recognition. A soldier leading a nation in crisis and a world-renowned sprinter had no political reason to connect, yet their simple exchange of letters sparked something extraordinary. It challenged assumptions. It blurred the lines between politics and humanity, sport and service, influence and responsibility. Bolt, whose fame was built on physical speed, discovered a different kind of impact: the speed at which compassion travels. And Traoré, often seen through the lens of geopolitics and military strategy, revealed himself as a man capable of deep reflection and humility. Their story teaches us that empathy is not weakness, and that vulnerability, when shared with honesty, can be a bridge instead of a barrier. It also teaches us that people across oceans can walk the same path if guided by a shared sense of purpose. Whether you're running on a track or leading a country through storms, The desire to be seen, to be heard, and to matter is universal. Through this story, we learn that legacy is not always built on medals or power. It can be built on moments of courage, on listening, on choosing connection over performance. We also see how young people, when exposed to such stories, can shift their dreams from escape to empowerment. If Usain Bolt can choose to amplify voices instead of just his brand, and if Captain Ibrahim Traoré can accept inspiration from an athlete rather than a general, then perhaps we all need to reconsider where we find strength. The lesson is simple but profound. The world changes not only through revolutions, but through letters. Not just through strategy, but sincerity. And not just through leaders, but through those willing to write, listen, and act together, across boundaries, across backgrounds, and across time. I didn't expect to feel this way. I clicked on the video out of curiosity, but by the end I found myself sitting in silence, genuinely moved. This wasn't just a story about a president or a runner. It was about two human beings who saw each other, truly saw each other across oceans, cultures, and backgrounds. What struck me most was how personal it all felt. In a world where everything is scripted and polished, these letters felt raw and sincere. The way Captain Ibrahim Traoré opened up about the pain and hope of his people, without bitterness, but with strength, reminded me of the quiet resilience I've seen in people around me. And Usain Bolt. I've always admired him as an athlete, but now I admire him as a man. His choice to use his platform to uplift a country many barely talk about. That takes courage. Not the loud, performative kind, but the kind that endures. I think this story touches something in all of us. It reminds us that we're not as far apart as we think. It shows that connection doesn't require power, just honesty. The image of a sprinter and a soldier exchanging thoughts, building trust, and creating impact without ever meeting face to face, that's something I'll carry with me. And the youth initiatives, the scholarship fund, the summit, this wasn't symbolism, it was action. It was proof that words can lead to real change. I hope more people see this. I hope more people realize that leadership doesn't have to be about shouting or dominating. Sometimes it's about writing back. Sometimes it's about listening. This story gave me hope, not in politicians or athletes, but in the possibility that when people care enough to reach out, even quietly, the world begins to shift. Thank you for sharing this.